these studies now flood the media in America. The most recent one I read was that meat causes diabetes, which is absurd because glucose drives diabetes, which isn't found in meat. But the study was funded by the church, in particular through government grants. So it's a win-win-win because for the corporations, selling highly processed industrial products is much more profitable than selling meat. For the church, it's a huge win because it validates their religious convictions. And the government benefits because everybody always has enough to eat. So if you're only eating Cheetos and bread, you don't really notice the price of inflation. It's very under control. But if you're going to buy the ribeye steak, it's like, wow.
Matthew, thank you so much for joining me. I recently finished your new book, Fiat Food, and I have to say it was a fascinating read. It opened my eyes to many things I'd never questioned before that were impacting my health negatively. Um, Before we get into all of that, can you talk a bit about your motivation to write this book? I know you read Saifedean's book, The Fiat Standard, which has a chapter on Fiat Food. But I'm curious what inspired you to take on this project as someone who usually specializes in investigating and reporting crime.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You're right. I'm not a nutritionist and I'm not an economist. So I'm an investigative reporter. And for most of my adult life, that's been my occupation. I worked at the New York Daily News for about 10 years, and my job was to swoop in anytime a major crime happened around the country and try to find the motive, like why it happened, particularly mass shootings. Um, when COVID happened here, I've always been very cynical of power structures, whether that be the government or corporate power. And I think that that was something naturally and innate in me, but also being a journalist in New York City for so long, you get used to the fact that politicians lie, and it's really just sort of almost inbred into the system at this point. But when COVID hit, like a lot of people, I began seeing a lot more inconsistencies. It appeared to me as though our leaders in America weren't even really pretending to have our best interest at heart at that point. And that led me to Saifedean's book, as you mentioned. I read the Bitcoin standard, but the fiat standard, which is it's an argument really for an alternative currency that's hard. And right now we're under a fiat currency where essentially a banking cartel can just magically print dollars. And we all have accepted this. But there was that chapter you mentioned called Fiat Food. And I really respect Saif, and I think he's a great mind, but I was just looking at this chapter. And in it, he outlines what appears to be this conspiracy between the government, religious groups, who combine with environmental groups and corporate powers to restructure the American food system. And in my initial reading, it was a brief chapter. I just thought, that's crazy. So I put my investigative reporter hat on and I began fact checking this chapter. And to my shock, Saifedean's chapter, he didn't overstate anything. In fact, if anything, he understated the argument. So I was blown away by this concept because it felt like I'd been living in a 50-year gaslighting campaign. And I was somebody who, I was pretty fat little kid. I grew up in the 90s under the dietary guidelines, which told us to eat 8 to 11 helpings of grains a day. And I ended up getting cancer when I was a teenager. I was out of commission with that for about 2 years. So health has always been the forefront of my mind. And I wanted to expose this. I wanted to blow his chapter up. I wanted to write an entire book on it. And I contacted, so I published books with Simon & Schuster and HarperCollins and like major publishing companies. But I immediately recognized that this book no publisher in America is going to be like, sure. Because the publishing system is, I submit my manuscript for a major publisher. It goes through several lines of edits, and then legal looks at it. And legal has to make sure that they're not going to get sued. So I realized that my finished product would not be what I wanted it to be. So I contacted Safe and I said, here's who I am. I want to tackle this project. He started his own publishing house. I was his first author. And Fiat Food is my first book with Safe, and I couldn't be more proud of it.
Amazing. Well, most people think of the government as an entity that exists to protect your rights if they're violated. But soon after the Federal Reserve was created, the US government started giving out these food guidelines and promoting certain kinds of nutritional studies. When I first heard about this, I found it very odd because I thought, well, why does the government care about what foods I eat? But you argue it actually benefits politicians to promote industrially processed junk as healthy food and condemn the eating of better and high quality nutritional sources like red meat. Why is that?
What I learned in my research was that the government doesn't want us to be miserable, and they don't want us to be happy. I mean, they don't want us to be unhappy. They're not some evil entity in that sense, but what they are is self-interested. And on August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold. So up until that point, our dollars were promissory notes for redeeming in gold at a bank. So they were just certificates that meant we had gold somewhere. And we committed a bit of a fraud here in America where we printed more promissory notes than we had gold in our reserves. So there was a concern that if too many countries came at the same time asking to redeem their dollars for gold, we would be exposed as a fraud. So Nixon was sort of forced into decoupling, and he did that on August 15th, 1971, when he essentially seized the gold of all the world, most of the world, by telling us that our certificates were no longer redeemable for gold. They were literally just redeemable in faith, which is a terrifying concept. And when this happened, the government understood that they were facing like a choice where monetary inflation, because of the increasing supply of dollars that could now, at this point, the dollars can now just be created out of nothing. There's no restraint. Was going to be chasing the same amount of goods approximately, resulting in like scarcity or increase in prices, or both, which has happened throughout history. So the government in America understands very clearly that the people will tolerate all kinds of corruption from their leaders and war, but high food prices is a different ballgame. And I would point to Sri Lanka in 2022, when the rising prices of food and meat and eggs led to them overthrowing the government. And there's been 12,500 food and energy-related riots dealing with the high prices in Europe over the past decade. So this is something that's very much the leadership is very sensitive to. And instead of coming clean with the American public and just saying, look, the price of the food that we eat is going to go up, they were incentivized to go on this campaign to restructure what the American diet was. So in 1970, in America, if you had money, you ate meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But suddenly, we began shifting the incentive. So we did that in several ways. The first one was through direct subsidies. So we began subsidizing corn, soy, and sugar quite a bit, which we did this. And now that we weren't on a gold standard, we didn't have to consult the public, because in a gold standard, you only have so much money in your treasury. So if you're going to give billions of dollars to the corn industry, you have to go to the American people and say, we need to raise taxes for this reason. But now, because we're not on a gold standard, they just print the money. And when they print that money, it's an insidious sort of theft from the American public, because it devalues everybody else's dollars. But they were able to do this and weaponize the fiat money printer to gear it towards corn, soy, and sugar. So suddenly you have lots of that flooding the market. And another way they did it was, as you mentioned, through restructuring the dietary guidelines. So in 1980, America released its first dietary guidelines, and it wasn't too bad. It did say don't eat as much meat. But it didn't have specific amounts. The real damage, I would argue, came in 1992 with the food pyramid, which specified that Americans should eat 8 to 11 servings of grains a day, and to eat meat sparingly. And if you ate it, have it be like skinless chicken that had no saturated fat. So saturated fat was lumped in at the very top of this pyramid to use sparingly with sugar. So it was a virtual recipe for metabolic destruction, and Americans obeyed this, though. They completely restructured their diet. They began eating significantly less red meat and significantly more grains. And, if you go into America, you go into a retailer called Walmart anytime, you'll see obesity in the line. Like it's a real problem. And a lot of Americans are exercising. They don't understand why they're gaining weight. They're listening to the best and the brightest, which leads to another component of this PSYOP, which was nutrition science. And a lot of people, especially who aren't familiar with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, don't understand how nutrition science has been captured by industry. The Seventh-day Adventist Church really began blossoming in the early part of the 19th century. And it was a movement started by a woman named, Ellen G. White. Yeah, you got it. Ellen G. White. And she got hit in the head by a rock and came out of it as a little girl, believing that she had visions from God. And God told her that the end days are coming, and she needs to dedicate her life to purifying people's spirits and souls and physical bodies. And you do this by crushing the human sex drive, because at the time, and this wasn't just her, a lot of people believed that all health issues were related to your overwhelming sex drive. So she tasked a young man named John Harvey Kellogg, who was a celebrity doctor of the day, to come up with a food to replace meat for breakfast. And he came up with Kellogg's cornflakes. And at the time, it didn't take immediately, but in short time, the Seventh-day Adventist Church founded an organization called the American Dietetic Association, which became the government's arm for nutrition. And then later they funded something called Loma Linda University in California, which is a university still run by the church, which is receiving hundreds of millions of dollars of government grants to push nutrition studies that all validate the religious convictions, which is that meat is bad. And the thing about these studies, and if you're not into research, or you're not a data dork like I am, you'll just see the headlines and say, oh, meat causes cancer, meat causes diabetes, but the actual research, they're observational studies, which is kind of like the equivalent of handing out flyers. They're uncontrolled, and they can't establish causal relationships. They can only establish relationships. So, for example, an observational study could tell you that 90% of all people who have had cancer have drinking milk. So the headline that could come out of that would be, new study finds milk causes cancer. And it's not science. I mean, it's something very different. So these studies now flood the media in America. The most recent one I read was that meat causes diabetes, which is absurd because glucose drives diabetes, which isn't found in meat. But the study was funded by the church, in particular through government grants. So it's a win-win-win, because for the corporations, selling highly processed industrial products is much more profitable than selling meat, because you can print Doritos like you can print fiat dollars. For the church, it's a huge win because it validates their religious convictions. And in recent years, they've sort of combined with environmental movements, which is also, I would argue, very religion-based And the government benefits because everybody always has enough to eat. So if you're only eating Cheetos and bread, you don't really notice the price of inflation. It's very under control. But if you're going to buy the ribeye steak, it's like, wow. So it's an interesting thing that's happened in America where food is very plentiful, but the nutrients essential to human life have become remarkably more expensive. And I would argue they've priced out lower income consumers. So in America, where obesity used to be a sign of like abundance and wealth, it's now a sign of poverty, not of finances, but of physical health. And it's because these people aren't getting enough nutrients. So when you don't get enough nutrients, you're eating all day, like grazing, like because you're constantly searching for food, not to mention the fact that a lot of these substances like refined sugar are highly addictive. And there's a health crisis here in America, and it's extremely disturbing. That's one of the reasons I felt it was important to get this book out.
Yeah, it's interesting how the term science has become a sort of shield against criticism. Some people would just label the most unscientific things scientific to capitalize on um, the widely respected status of science, which is completely antithetical to what science actually is. Um, the body of scientific knowledge actually grows by criticizing our current theories. But today, if you doubt, the over exaggeration of global warming or the impact of eating meat on your health or on the planet, then people are just like, oh, so you're denying the science? Um, as I like to say, I think the phrase evidence says has become the new Bible says.
I think that's really, really astute. I would point to how I would point to COVID as a silver lining, being that the credentialed experts who have for decades really we've trusted. There's been a break in large segments of the American population where we no longer trust them. And people are really looking to themselves now. It's like, should I be eating 8 to 11? Should I be taking all these shots? Like, and I think that's a really great thing. I think self-autonomy is, you talk about science. I used to eat tons of grains and I didn't feel so great. Um, Now I eat only meat, I drink raw milk, and I feel amazing. And athletically, I'm able to do more. And I mean, that's kind of science, right? Like, I'm not controlling all the variables, as many variables as I would like, but I did change something very, very important in the way I consume food, and I can see the results in myself. And every at least 5 times a week, I get a message from somebody who tells me they've read my book and they've changed their diet and they feel fantastic. And that's just great to hear.
We often hear this advice to eat everything in moderation. And I think Saifuddin discusses this in his chapter of your book. Although quoting this cliche seems pretty wise, moderation is always vaguely defined, and such a compromise between healthy and junk foods is definitely not as optimal as just the healthy route. Would you say that even opting for an unhealthy route like a vegan diet and then correcting that error when you realize you made a mistake could be more beneficial than just choosing to eat everything in moderation?
Yeah, this is kind of embarrassing because I used to say that. I used to say, "Oh, in moderation, it's fine." It's stupid. That's a dumb phrase. It's meaningless. Well, what about what amount of horse shit should I eat? Like, in moderation, what is the proper No, no, we should eat the food specific to human diets. And in the case of our species, that's red meat. That's most beneficial. And historically, I mean, I don't think there's much debate about that. People, I live in Arizona. I can't just eat blueberries here in Arizona, in the winter. So I do think that historically people have eaten fruits and vegetables, but very short amounts of time. When you could get to a blueberry berry in a blueberry bush in the Northeast when a bear didn't get to it, or maybe you find some raw honey somewhere, but not every day. and not as a foundation of a diet. That hasn't been the case. So I think it's troubling to me because sometimes when I'm out to eat with a group, which is always, you never want to talk about this when you're out to eat with people, right? Because they're all ordering their pasta and their burgers with their buns, and I'm just getting my like steak or my burger patties. And it always seems to come up, and like, why are you doing that? Why aren't you having your French fries into seed oils? Like, well, they act like you're doing some sort of fad, like it's a fad diet. But I would push back and say, no, the fad diet's been the past 50 years when we introduced all this shit into the American diet. How we were eating before 1970 was far more relevant to how humans should be eating. And that was going on for thousands of years. So we're in this fad, this failed experiment, and it's gone horribly wrong. I mean, the people are struggling and they're sick.
Yeah. So some glorify the consumer price index as an accurate measure of inflation, which tracks the.
You're hitting all my favorite topics.
So apparently it tracks the. So it actually tracks the average basket of consumer goods purchased by the average household across a period of time. But I think your view is that that measure significantly downplays the effect of inflation. Why is that?
It's a statistical tautology. The consumer price index, first of all, when it first came out in the early 1900s during World War I, it was a pretty good measure because it kept like a handful of basic goods that people used. But what happened was they had to change it because it revealed in time prices rising, which wasn't good for the politicians. So the consumer price index is currently marketing by our federal government. And the way they do it, it's okay. So if I'm eating steak, but my steak goes up in price too much, and I switch to a shitstorm chemical patty made of impossible meat developed by Bill Gates, I've cut down it, and I pay half price for it. The consumer price index won't show that my choices. It just says that I'm spending half as much. So it doesn't adjust to consumer preference. And because of that, and the other thing is you read my book, so you saw the section where Arthur Burns, who was the former Treasury Secretary, began taking things out taking things out and putting things in. They keep messing with it to try to get the results they want. So they're not looking for how much prices are rising. What they're actually looking to do is get something that the American public will swallow that further empowers them, because they had in the fiat money printer since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, when the United States dollar at that time became the global reserve currency for almost every other country. So in the fiat money printer, the United States government has I would argue, the most powerful tool in the history of the world, where they can actually take the productive labor of not just America, but the entire world. They can weaponize it to whatever goal they want. And they're going to do anything they can to maintain it. So in American universities, you do not get a university job if you're not an advocate of the fiat money printer. So all the economists that come out are all court jesters of the fiat money printer, talking about why we need to constantly create more money. Nobody in university, or very, very few, and I don't know how those people survive there, would ever espouse a hard currency. They act like that's nuts. But just a few years ago, in 1970, everybody was in agreement that you don't just create money out of nothing, because that's fraud. I mean, George Washington spoke extensively about it. There's been many failed experiments throughout history. It always ends the same way. It never ends well. And we're in America, we're experiencing the fiat death cycle now. We don't see it so clearly, but we're in it. It takes longer because it's not just America. It's the whole world whose wealth we're extrapolating through fiat because the other currencies are so attached to it. But it's beginning to end. You see other countries. I think we overplayed our hand with Russia and Ukraine when we began freezing Russia's assets. They were like, well, we don't need the dollar. And that hurt us. We don't want to admit it, but of course it hurt us. And now there's trade going on with oil that isn't over the dollar. So the CPI, I could talk about. It's one of my favorite topics because it's just so transparently dumb. And everybody in America acts like it's information when it comes out. They're like, oh my gosh, the CPI rose. It's a statistical tautology also because we're basing goods based on American dollars, but the American dollars are based on the goods in a circular because the value of the dollar is degrading so quickly.
Yeah. So replacing fiat foods with superior alternatives has some obvious economic and personal benefits, like saving on medical expenses since you're not getting sick all the time from eating all this garbage. What are some non-obvious or second-order benefits that you can that you think can come about if you switch to sound food?
Oh, that's a great question. The biggest benefit for me has been, dude, like I used to think about food all the time. So I used to structure my day around my meals. So I go on vacation and it seemed like my vacations with my family were all like things we would do in between meals. Like, the meals were the thing. I don't think about food as much, like I'm living my life. I'm hungry. I eat steak. I eat ribeyes and burger patties, and I drink water. Still not off of coffee, but I've reduced it significantly. I'm working on that. I'm not thinking about it a lot. Like I just don't. So it's freed up my mind to be human and live like the life of a human and try to produce. My production level has gone up a lot. Gone are the days where I'm eating chicken nuggets and then I have to like rest for an hour because I just ate. Like how much of my life I've given away in that sense makes me terrified. But that's been my biggest notice. It's that my mind is more free. I incorporated raw milk because my weight dropped too quickly on the carnivore. I don't know if I was not eating enough, but the raw milk then helped my my weight maintain. I play a lot of sports, so especially basketball, and everybody's younger than me and bigger than me, and I get thrown around a lot if I don't maintain some sort of weight. So I've been on that, but the biggest has been mental clarity. I'm able to think clearly, even little things like when I'm working, I'm converting notes from my pad to the computer and I'm typing them out. I can remember it sounds like a little thing, but I can remember far more now just moving, and I'm 46. So my cognitive abilities really should not be improving much at this point. But what happened is I think when I stopped eating poison and heavy carbs, and seed oils and sugar all the time, I think what happened was it was just, I don't think I improved as much as the mask that prevented me from just being naturally who I was. The suit of armor I was carrying that I didn't know I was wearing until I took it off just vanished, and I was able to just thrive, which I think is our natural state.
Yeah. In your book, you have sections on how Bitcoin fixes all these evils caused by fiat. And I think I totally agree with most of them. But the obvious next question is how do we move from a fiat standard to a Bitcoin standard? So how do you envision that transition to look like?
Yeah, I have no idea. So what I know is, and also it wouldn't just have to be Bitcoin.
Yeah.
It could be anything that destroyed the fiat money printer. So it isn't as much Bitcoin as destroying the fiat money printer, because when the fiat money printer is destroyed, there is no longer an incentive to carry on this masquerade that Fruit Loops are food and we should push these as like a viable, healthy food option. Like there's no reason then. So what ending fiat does, what Bitcoin does is destroy the Fed. the Federal Reserve's ability to use fiat. And the end of fiat would be the end of the gaslighting campaign because there'd be no incentive. There's no incentive to mask inflation when there is no inflation. So that's really ultimately my argument on how Bitcoin solves it. But I'm open to other alternatives. It's just from my understanding and talking to Saifedean, who I regard as a genius, it's the best one. Gold is problematic because throughout history, it's constantly getting confiscated. So there's this pattern with gold where people have gold, they trade with gold, everybody's happy with gold. And then the government says, you don't want to carry your gold, keep the gold at the bank, we'll give you paper for gold. And then the government at some point is like, you don't need the gold, keep your paper, we have your gold. And this cycle continues over and over again. So I don't trust that gold would not be centralized.
Do you think that's
Bitcoin
a
can't be.
technological? Do you think that's a technological problem? I think Alden, who I think also published her book Broken Money with
Yeah, she published under Safe's House too.
I think she argues that like we've reached like this technological point where Bitcoin allows um, for these evils like gold being confiscated by the government or being centralized. So we've reached like this technological point where we can actually have a sustainable hard currency. I wonder what you think about that.
I've read her book and I think she's great. And she definitely understands economics better than I do. I still consider myself largely a student of economics. And I think that's spot on. I think that it doesn't, all these hard currencies, whatever happens, it's not so much what they can do for us to trade, because people can decide what they want to trade with and how they want to trade. I zero in on the distortion created by the Federal Reserve and this money printing and the vile evils that have occurred from it, and the confiscation of countless people's wealth through this. And all of these accomplish that. But Bitcoin seems like, I mean, when I'm out and I'm doing like a book signing, I always tell people, pay in Bitcoin. You want to buy my book, pay in Bitcoin. Like every dollar you spend in Bitcoin, every Satoshi you spend in Bitcoin, you're slinging an arrow at the Federal Reserve. And the more of us who do it, even at the smallest level, it builds. And I'm at the point right now where I buy and sell things often from Bitcoin, but not primarily. I still have to use fiat. And man, that pisses me off.
I really admire young people who've just done amazing stuff in a world where that generally doesn't take them seriously. So while researching you for this episode, I discovered your daughter, Hildy Kate Lysiak.
Oh,
And
no. The famous one in the family, right?
the famous one, but I'm curious if your thoughts regarding freedom have influenced the way you raise your children.
Oh, that's a great question. Very, very much so, passionately. I live in a house where, yeah, my daughter Hildy, like all of my girls, I have 4 daughters. I have a 9-year-old, 12-year-old, Hildy's 17. I have a 20-year-old. They're all fiercely independent. And Hildy in particular, when she was, when she reports, she was a newspaper reporter. She founded a newspaper, and she was the first to cover a murder in a town when she was 8 and 9. She was 9 at the time, and has published a book series under Scholastic, I think 6 books, has an autobiography out, and there's a TV show about her called Home Before Dark. And she doesn't, she values her freedom very, very much. And it's interesting because we talk a lot about, she has a lot of money for a young kid. And we always look at the money as freedom. It's like, that's freedom for you. Like, where you don't have to, you could travel here, you could do this. But I do notice that I think there was a divide, just like there's a divide in America politically. There's a real divide in America with young people. I noticed that there's a lot of young people who just seemed far more passive than I was at that age, where I would never have been masked in a school when I was a kid. I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have listened, and neither would have my friends. We just wouldn't have done it. We would have what? Oh, but on the flip side, there's also a lot of dynamic kids who are pushing Bitcoin, and they grew up in a different time where my parents saw America land a man on the moon and just had great trust in our leaders. And today, these kids are growing up in the wake of the coronavirus, where a lot of these leaders in America were exposed as complete frauds. And I'm trying to pull the curtain back on the dietary frauds that are happening through fiat. And there's like tons of people like yourself who are, pushing the envelope on, human rights and what it means to be free. And yeah, I'm proud of all my kids, and I try hard. We have passionate arguments about all kinds of issues, which in my house, which is fun, but also kind of taxing sometimes. But the food thing is hard to get through to them because everybody they know eats the standard American diet. Like and my wife is on board with me now too, but we're the ones who are pushing this, and they're starting to see it because they start to see, oh, my friends' parents are really, they're not playing basketball a lot. They're definitely not running every day. And so starting to get through to them, but it's hard to unpack it all.
Final question: if you were to recommend, someone to get started with the real food diet, as you call it, or the carnivore diet, what would you recommend they start with? Like
I asked Nina Teichos this question, and she's been helpful for my book. She did a lot of research in a book called The Big Fat Surprise, which is just fantastic. And I asked her this question when I started on the carnivore diet myself, and she said, most important thing you could do is start off your day with meat. Like, because then at least you have some armor against the cravings that are going to come, because you're going to get the nutrients your body needs. So in the morning, I do a run in the morning, and then I have a ribeye, like every morning. I don't even think about it. It's just what I have to do. And I'm fortunate that I can afford these ribeyes because they're expensive. But if you can't afford ribeyes, ground beef, you still get ground beef or eggs. Start off the day good. And if you fall off the horse, it happens. This is addictive. Don't beat yourself up too much. Just get back on. If you need sugar, do raw milk. Like if the cravings come, I do a glass of raw milk and then I feel better. But start your day off with red meat is the best advice that she gave me that I hope I can pass on to your audience.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Matt. Really appreciate it. I recommend everybody read your new book, Fiat Food, which will be linked in the description below. Yeah, any final thoughts?
No, man, thanks. Talk about young people doing great things yourself. Thanks for having me and helping me get this message out. I think it's so important. When you come to America, you have to find me.
Of course.
Look me up on Twitter, and we're going to go out. I'm going to take you to the best steak place ever. We're just going to dine on ribeye steak and, maybe a little bacon. We'll make a day.
That sounds awesome.